This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times, no matter when.
Do his work. So he was well known around Vienna. He was like almost a tourist site, So there's St. Stephen's, there's the Belvedere, there's Brahms, that sort of thing, right? He had worked out his life like the bachelor that he was. He had worked his life out into a completely comfortable routine. It's kind of fun to look at him because I can relate to this a lot. I have a work life and all that, but I'm a man of routine. Get up at the same time, do the same things. I get all bent out of shape and my routine gets messed up. And I'm sure a lot of us are like that. And he was like that. At this point, he was a lifelong bachelor as of the time of the First and Second Symphonies. He knew what he wanted. He knew what he liked and what he didn't like. And so he was able to live the life he wanted. He was a man of independent means by this point. He was very comfortable. His compositions were selling very well. And the German Requiem alone was bringing him in a lot of money, not to mention all of the chamber works, vocal works, piano works, the symphonies as they started coming out. He was in demand. He could demand high fees from publishers, and he had a relationship with one publisher in particular, Simrock, Fritz Simrock in Vienna, who published everything he wrote, basically. And Brahms could pretty much command the fees he wanted. Simrock always knew that if maybe he overpaid for one work, there might be another one comes along that's a big hit and will make up the money. No publisher ever lost money on Brahms. Just imagine if he had had recordings and he could be picking up residuals, ASCAP and BMI and all of that, or videos or so on. He also made money as a conductor, either a guest conductor or sometimes conducting in Vienna, where he conducted some choirs and so on there. He turned down the conductorship of the Hamburg Orchestra. He'd wanted it all his life. They offered it to him, and it was too late by then. And I think he wrote them a very rather bittersweet little letter about it. He said, what we should be doing is celebrating my 20th anniversary as your conductor and not asking me to become your conductor this year. It's like dig, stab, stab. But still, he could turn it down, right? He could turn it down. He turned down the conductorship in Dusseldorf, where Schumann had been. He didn't want to bother. He didn't have to. He had income. He was comfortable. Everything was fine. And since he had very, very few creature needs, he was not a person who needed a lot of stuff. He didn't even have his own furniture. His landlady, his lovely, his housekeeper, Frau Kruxar, who had actually provided him with her furniture. And so he would use that. He had these nice rooms, very nice, and he sort of spread out bit by bit. They were always rented, and eventually he bought the place. So he had that, and he had a huge library, which he had, and that was all his stuff. But everything else, he didn't really care. He was one of those people, material possessions simply had no interest for him. That's very much unlike certain other composers like Handel, right, who loved the good things in life. Good things in life for Brahms were walks out in the park, nature, friends, rustic good food, not great stuff, nice wines, beer, yeah, thank you, yeah. Cigars. That was about it. So, in the morning, he got up about 5 o'clock a.m. He got up at 5, and he always started out by brewing a cup of coffee so strong you could almost stand the spoon up in it. And he always did it himself. Nobody could get the coffee good enough for him. So he always did it himself. And I love the fact that he had an admirer in France, in Marseille, that knew this was a particular coffee he really liked. And so he always sent him a big bulk shipment of it, often enough that Brahms never ran out. Woe betide the guy if Brahms ever ran out, right? So he would always have that, and he always had 1 cup of it. That was the first thing. No breakfast, just 1 cup. Okay? Yeah. Very, very fussy about that. Now, After that, he went out for a big long walk. This is how he kept himself, well, he wasn't fit or trim, but I think it's probably how he kept himself going for as long as he made it, given his diet and lifestyle. He did live to be 67, so, and that's not very good, but given the way he ate, it's not bad at all. But he would go for a nice big long walk. He loved to go out for walks, sort of shuffling along with his stogie hanging out of his mouth, around the streets of Vienna. So, and that would be probably a few hours in the morning if it wasn't too cold, and all that. It would be that. Then he would work. He would go to work then, and the rest of the morning would be composing, sketching, working at the piano, doing that. He was a very hard worker. This man did not have a lazy bone in his body. Now, lunch and dinner was fun. He did not eat in. He never ate in. He always went out. And like so many people like Brahms, he had a favorite restaurant, and basically it became his dining room. It was his restaurant. He almost never went anywhere else. It was called the Red Hedgehog. It's so associated with him that not long ago, about 10 years ago, a performing group in Vienna opened up a little tiny recital hall, and they call it the Red Hedgehog. And you look it up on the internet, and you think, oh, it's still there. You think, oh, no, that's not it. It's long gone. It's one of these nice little places. It had a good dining room in the front, which was the fancy one, and then it had a side room. That was just very nice. Well, that's where Brahms wanted to be, was in the side room. He didn't want to be bothered because by the 1870s, he was driven out of his mind by autograph seekers and by people who came to see him, and I can imagine he's sitting there trying to have his lunch and said, oh, Mr. Brahms, I just loved your first symphony, and I'm going to tell you how much I thought it was wonderful, or something. Now, listen here, I heard a performance of the German Requiem last month. There was a word misspelled in the program, and and I'm sure he was tired of that, or, oh, can you take me, my daughter, she wants to take piano lessons, all of that. So I'm sure he couldn't stand any of that, being the kind of guy he was. So he would go to this simple room in the back, and that was, if you were in the know, you could get in there. If you were one of Brahms' friends, if you come in, if you're Theodor Billroth, say, oh, of course, Theodor Billroth, come right in, he's there having lunch, Otherwise, Brahms? Oh, no, he's not here, That's how they work. Now, they knew his routine. They knew exactly what he liked, they knew the dishes he liked, and they knew to make them. He didn't have to order or anything. He could just come in and sit down and say, it's time for my lunch. Oh, yes, sir, here it is, And they knew. It was like his own housekeeper. So they know exactly. He never liked fancy dishes, fancy cooking, never. What he liked was good plain fare, almost rustic. By our standards, of course, it would have been an absolutely appalling diet. Cholesterol like up to there, and so on. Heart attack on a plate twice a day, right? And so on. But that was the diet of the day, right? And all of that. So he liked a lot of that. And they always kept him a very, very high-class Tokai wine for him because that's what he liked after dinner or after lunch. He didn't drink very much. He wasn't a heavy drinker at all, but he did like good wines. Okay, did like good wines. It was so well known that when he was in Vienna, which was during all but the summer, when he was in Vienna, people knew he was going to be there. And so one of the things the front staff at the Hedgehog had to do was kind of run interference for him and make sure that nobody bothered him because he was their most prized guest. And it's because of him that the Red Hedgehog has gone down in history. Otherwise, they were just a little corner restaurant. It wasn't a fancy place at all. It wasn't quite a diner, by that, but it was no fancy place, and that's just exactly what he would like. Nothing fancy, but that. So, there he is, day after day, lunch, dinner at the Hedgehog, and so on. In the afternoons, after he finished his lunch at the Hedgehog, he'd go back to work. Go back to his apartment at 4 Karlgasse. He would, of course, work on preparing scores for performances, correcting parts, doing he did all his own copy work. He didn't use copyists. So he would sit there and, for the most part, work out all the parts and all that. He was very fussy about things. Anything that didn't meet his standards went right into the fireplace. Very fussy about things. But he also did a lot of editing. Brahms was an early musicologist. As a matter of fact, among two of his best friends were Philip Spitta, who was the author of one of the great biographies of Bach, and Eusebius Matuszewski, who was actually a wonderful, again, musicologist who eventually put out a complete edition of Brahms. He was always getting letters from people wanting him to edit things. For example, he was a founding father of the Bach-Gesellschaft. Brahms was one of the founding members of it. And that was the great edition that was formed in the 19th century to collect and publish all of Bach's known music. And Brahms was one of the people that helped fund it. And he always said, when a new volume of the Bach-Gesellschaft arrives, he said, I drop everything until I've completely absorbed it. And he would. He was a founding father of the Handel-Gesellschaft as well. He actually edited the complete music of François Couperin. It's his name on there, the French Baroque composer with Friedrich Chrysander. He edited it. A lot of other stuff. He was a very, very historically minded man. He owned the autograph of the Mozart G minor symphony, Mozart's own copy of it. He owned it. It was one of his treasured possessions. Wagner sent him the score to Meistersinger, and he lost it. He got it back eventually, but still. So he would do all this kind of work. He was a very, very busy man. And business he didn't worry about. Well, he let Fritz Simrock handle his business. And we've got letters like he'll say, Fritz, I'm going on a trip. I need money. Send it now. And that sort of thing. It's like his personal banker. Now, in the evenings, very domestic man, he would either go to friends' houses. Of course, he had also, I'll talk about friends in a moment, and socialize, or he'd just stay in his rooms, which is what he really liked. He really did. Boy, I can relate to this man. I'm a homebody down to my toes, I really am. And he would just stay there at Karl Goss reading very quietly. He was a voracious reader. He had an enormous library. And he knew his stuff inside and out. This is a man who could quote Shakespeare line by line if he wanted to, in English, I should mention. He was something. He really was. This man was a very quiet, happy intellectual in his own house. He's just like a big teddy bear, and it's just lovely. Now, in the summers, he got away from Vienna, and his pattern was always to go somewhere gorgeous. He was a person who absolutely adored nature. He loved to go out for long walks out in the woods. And of course, living where he did, he had so much incredibly beautiful stuff around him. Germany and Austria both, those were his favorite places. Generally for about 3 months out of the year, maybe 4 months, he would stay somewhere in Austria and Germany, and that's where he did his composition. Fresh composition almost always happened when he was away from Vienna. When he was in Vienna, he was doing all the mopping up work. Now, many of these places, for example, he would stay at a country inn that wasn't too expensive. He might stay in a spa. Once in a while, he even stayed in a few places like Bad Ischl, which actually became a very, very popular place, and so on. But generally speaking, what he liked were little towns. And he liked to stay in very small little places, what we would now call bed and breakfasts. So that's what he likes. I was thinking I stayed in a place up in Anchor Bay last summer. Man, Brahms would have loved that place, It was just out in the middle of nowhere. You walked down a long stairway to get to the beach. There was nobody there. That's great. He would have loved that. And Austria and Switzerland, he loved to go there. Anywhere he had mountains and forests and places to go on long walks, and so on. But he also loved Italy. And a lot of times he went to Italy and he'd stay in various places. He didn't get as much work done in Italy. Who does? Because he's out. He loved architecture and he loved history. And of course, this man with all this art and architecture in his head, Italy must have just been like a toy box for him. And so just go wandering all around, I'm sure, going, oh, look at that, wow, and having a wonderful time. In other words, it's a very good life. He always had friends. He didn't go alone. He almost always had companions with him, generally friends of his that would come. Sometimes they would pay for everything, and other times he did. Didn't really matter. Now, his basic nature was gregarious. Basically, even though he was a bachelor who lived alone and sort of had a whole cushioned life for himself, he really did need a lot of people. He was not a loner by any means. However, he was also a little short-tempered. More than a little, okay? His social graces were not very good. I've mentioned that before. As a young man, he had a very bad problem with that. As he got older, it got worse. And so he would get grumpy and even testy sometimes. There's a story of one evening, for example, at some poor, hapless hostess's house. She rubbed him the wrong way. somehow. Who knows? I mean, the fish was overdone or something. I don't know. And he started getting really testy with everybody. And the story is, as he left the house, he said, "Well, if there's anybody here I have not offended tonight, I apologize." Stop. A little defensive, a little testy, and so on. You never knew. You read stories about some of his behavior and think, oh God, he's acting like a spoiled brat teenager. Sometimes, other times, he could be just absolutely wonderful. So he really was one thing and the other. Many people have only memories of him as a warm, generous, giving person. Other people have memories of him as the house guest from hell. And he was all of those things. One of the things that he was very quiet about was that he was generous with his money. He was a very soft touch. And as a matter of fact, he was always slipping money to help people out. And he was terrified that anybody would ever mention it. He never wanted anybody to know this, but the fact is he was a very, very generous, warm-hearted, giving man. So I've used the word before, cream puff, about him. Crusty on the outside, soft, squishy, and sweet on the inside. That's what his heart was, very big and very soft and very warm. And he masked it with this somewhat gruff, testy exterior. It's almost a cliche, isn't it? But that fact is sometimes cliches are true. He was. He had a big circle of friends because he had no family of his own after his parents had passed on, and he grew very distant from his siblings, with his two siblings. So all of his friends had to put up with this to some degree or another. And I should mention that some of them were no slouches in the testiness and grumpiness department themselves. So it made for a very interesting bunch of relationships. But you know something? He only lost a few friends permanently. Most of the time, they stayed with him to the end. And he outlived almost all of them, as we'll talk next week, which is part of his last years. Now, there's way too many for me to talk about all these friends that were an important part of his life, but there are a few that need to be singled out, of course. And the two big ones, as you remember through the rest of the class, Joseph Joachim, of course, Joachim, the great violinist and conductor, that was his first big friend in music and remained throughout life. Yes, it was an up and down relationship, but it remained. And the other was the great love of his life, Clara Schumann. No matter what they decided, no matter how they lived their lives, there is no question that Clara Schumann and Johannes Brahms could have been a couple very easily after Robert died. And there's no person in this world that Brahms loved more than Clara Schumann. And there's no one that she loved more than him except her own husband, in the memory of him. So it doesn't matter how many times they wound up not speaking to each other. And they had fights. She was very melancholic, and she got very upset a lot, and of course he did. So it didn't matter. He and Joachim almost broke up permanently at one point, but never completely. So they were family, really, when you get right down to it. He belonged to them as they did to him, and they sustained all the way through. Clara's death, which occurred before him, was one of the greatest blows of his life when she died. Now, of the other friends, there are a couple I do want to bring up because they are worth mentioning, and they were very important people to him. And in Brahms' life, they were great sources of support and love and generosity. And of those, the first and foremost is Theodor Billroth. This brilliant, cultivated man, surgeon, and a great gentleman. I mean, he really does exemplify the word gentleman. He was one of Brahms's closest friends through most of his adult life in Vienna. He was almost as high as Joachim and Schumann in Brahms's own esteem. Even though he was not a musician, he was one of those people who was so well trained in music and such a discerning listener and connoisseur of music that he was a far more discerning person than most professional musicians. He was the recipient of a lot of manuscripts. His library included a lot. There's quite a few dedications. And in his beautiful home, of course he was a wealthy man, he often put on salons and they would premiere Brahms' latest works, vocal works, chamber works, and so on. He was this elegant, fine host. He and Brahms had a very warm relationship. Later on, Billroth had a stroke which affected him mentally quite a bit, and his personality changed some. And their last few years were not estranged, but they weren't what they had been. But Brahms understood. I mean, it wasn't Billroth, it was the stroke that had changed him. Now, another person who was very, very important to him was this wonderful woman, Elisabeth von Herzogenberg. She was a singer. Many of his lady friends were singers, and so on. She was the daughter of a diplomat, and everybody called her Liesel. She married a conductor, Heinrich von Herzogenberg, who was actually a very fine conductor, a champion of Brahms' music. He was also a very mediocre composer, and that was a real problem for Brahms, who was always having to pass judgment on his works and kind of hold his tongue. Like, yes, it's very good, Heinrich, so on. But the fact is, Liesel loved Brahms. She was a wonderful sort of, again, sounding board for him, and she opened their home, which was a very nice home, to him. She was one of those people that she saw to it that he ate well when he was with them. There's even one wonderful letter from her. He was going to go visit them somewhere. They were on a vacation somewhere. He was going to go visit them, but he was going to stay in a hotel because he didn't want to be a burden. And she wrote him back all indignant. What do you mean you're not staying with us? What do you mean? I've got to fix, you don't even ask. I will fix your breakfast and lunch. I'll get everything the way you want it. How dare you? It's like, so, and all that. She was like that, and it was a very, very close circle. She was one of the people that could have been. She was potentially another wife figure, although that never actually happened. So I haven't done much gossip lately, but a rather fun bit of gossip is that a member of this whole circle was a British composer named Ethel Smith. Female, very interesting. And there was a very interesting dynamic going on because Ethel Smith was a lesbian who had a huge crush on Liesel. And so that was all kind of getting in the middle of all of that, with Brahms over here and Heinrich over that. So that must have been very interesting if you could look inside people's heads and watch what was going on, and all of that. Kind of a cool circle of people, very modern in many ways. Cool stuff. So this is our Brahms. This is his life. Several classes ago, in the last class, I didn't have a chance to do Symphony No. 2, and I wanted to, but we didn't have, so now's the time. The fact is, once Brahms broke through the logjam of Symphony No. 1, everything poured out, as it were. Symphony No. 2 came a year later, and it had not been 22 years in the making. It was like 22 weeks. He wrote it like that. Now, the second symphony, here's what he says. Here's Clara Schumann says, Johannes came this evening and played me the first movement of his second symphony in D major, which highly delighted me. It seems to me more deeply conceived than the first movement of the first symphony. I also heard part of the last movement and I'm full of joy over it. He is sure to gain a much more striking success in public with this symphony than he did with the first, enthusiastic as we musicians are over its inspiration and wonderful skill. Truer words never spoken. Everybody's always loved the second symphony. I mean, who doesn't love the Brahms second, I mean, come on, It's just this most wonderful, sunny, exuberant piece of music, but it's just as well made as the first is. Whoa, stop that. You go back there. Now, superficially, it seems totally different. It's lighthearted, it's shorter, it doesn't have this monumental sense. It's lyrical, it's genial. The finale is a great big exuberant arm-flung celebration. But under the surface, it's more similar than you might think. It's the work of the same guy. And the work of the same kind of strong mind that puts together music with such great integrity. For example, all the way through this, there's a neighbor tone motif. Now, a neighbor tone is very simple. All it is, note, either the note above or below, and the back to the note. So it's either shaped like a V or an inverted V. Yum, bum, bum, or yum, bum, bum. In this case, lower. Ya, da, dee. That's the idea that permeates this entire symphony. La, dee, da. Tiny little bitty seed. Little bitty seed. And typical Brahms again, he's always fair about this. Always fair. It's the first thing you hear. The first three notes are a neighbor tone. And then you hear it again. Okay? Ya-di-da-yum. That's Brahms telling you, this is what I'm making the piece out of. Anytime he does that, you can count on it. La-da-dee-dee. The finale, the main theme of the finale is ya-ba-bum-ba-bum-bum-bee, ya-da-da, ya-da-da-da-dum-bum-bee. There it is. Right? And he even goes so far, I think I have a slide on this, the very last figure in the whole symphony. Now, I'll tell you, don't have a slide on it. The very last figure of the symphony takes ya-da-da, inverts it, and it becomes ya-dum-bum-ba, ya-da-yum-ba-dum-bum-ba, yum-ba-bum-ba-dum-bum-bum-ba. Yeah! Man, get the guy right, you know? Now, it also thirds, right? Ya-bum-bum-bum-bum, right? Ya-ba-bum, be-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba, ya-ha-ha-ha, third. Just like in the first symphony. Right? Ba-yum, be-yum, ba. Thirds everywhere. Thirds everywhere. Thirds. During the development section in the first movement, he really picks up that ya-dum, bum-ba-bum, yada, yada. Listen to this. Dee-dum, dee-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. Yeah, you see? Yeah, it's all over the place, where he does that. And the very famous second theme of this symphony, which reminds a lot of people of the Wagenlied, the lullaby, the Brahms lullaby, it reminds people, well, it's a thirds relationship. Ya, ya, da, dee, oh, hee, ya, ya, da, dee, da, da, da. And pardon me, and if I get a little technical here, but it's an F sharp minor, which is a third above the original key. Yeah, cool. La da dum, dee dee dee, third. Yeah, so it's everywhere. And then that brilliant brass conclusion. This is where you get the inverted neighbor tone. La dum bum bum. But the trumpets are playing in thirds. One's ya da da da, and one's yum da dee da. Yeah. And then third. Oh, gosh, get he right. You give this guy an egg and a cup of water and you say, John, make dinner, and he does. He invents the omelet, you know? It's just an amazing composer. Well, I want to go over little bits of two of the movements of this symphony, and the one I would like to do is a little bit of the slow movement, which often gets overlooked. I think everybody's so turned on to the first movement with the lullaby and that big thrilling last movement, but the slow movement, this may be one of his all-time best. It's one of his most heartfelt utterances, just heartfelt. And we're going to hear a little bit of it in the wonderful Klemperer recording with the Philharmonia Orchestra. And give you pictures of Brahms, and we're going to show him all the way through. You've seen a lot of the youthful pictures. I'm going to get more, and I'm going to take him all the way through the old age. Okay, so you kind of watch him as he changes over the years from GQ model to Santa Claus, bit by bit. So this is Otto Klemperer conducting. It's the Philharmonia Orchestra. Any list of the top 5 sets of the Brahms symphonies, this has to be in there. Beautiful recordings, one of the great orchestras of Europe, and nobody could do this stuff like Klemperer, one of our great conductors of the German Rep. Trivia about Otto Klemperer, by the way, trivia you might like to know. His son, Werner Klemperer, played Colonel Klink on Hogan's Heroes. So, yes, that's right. Yes, they are the same. Okay, here we go. You've seen these. It happens. And there he is as the later years. Look at that gaze. Can you imagine those cornflower blue eyes just right into you like that? Glorious stuff. Well, you know, when it comes, though, to the Second Symphony, who amongst us doesn't look forward to the last movement, huh? You know? And I want to give you the last part of it. This is the recapitulation. It's the third part of the movement where everything comes back. In a particularly another one of my top 5 sets, this is a recent one, Simon Rattle at the head of the very young now Berlin Philharmonic. You know, it's become a fairly young orchestra nowadays. But technically second to none in the world. And they certainly just play the spots off of this thing perfectly. And to accompany it, pictures of its hometown, Vienna. So a little Vienna tour guide, bunch of pictures with this glorious recap of the Brahms Second, surely the most joyous finale in all symphonic music. Very quiet at the opening. Spot a lot of your favorite places if you want. great piece and a really, really good performance. You know, there are a lot of good performances of the pieces out there, but that's, to me, one of the ones that checks off a lot of boxes, you know, and so on. So we'll be hearing from that set again. It's excellent. It's on EMI, by the way. Very, very good stuff. Now, in these wonderful years, he was at absolute peak productivity. This is this great time for the man, the 1870s and 80s. The chamber music flowed out of him. He is the one-ranking chamber composer of the second half of the century. Chamber music had been big in the first half. Beethoven, Schubert, Mendelssohn, Schumann all wrote lots of it, but the late Romantics didn't. I mean, think of Wagner, Liszt, Verdi. Bruckner, you know, no. But Brahms, yes. And everything he wrote, of course, is standard repertory for its instruments. I'm very lucky as a pianist because over the years I've played every single Brahms chamber work with piano. I've had a chance to get to know all of it. What an honor. And I played with some darn good players too. I played with some that weren't so good, but that's a completely different story. The first violin sonata, the G major, this is one of everybody's favorite pieces, and for good reason. What a great piece of music. This is in a recent recording, by the way. Nikolai Znaider with Yefim Bronfman. Really good. RCA Red Seal. Marvelous. Now, this is one of the products of those happy summers where he was out in the country. And as a matter of fact, this is Portschach. He loved Portschach, and he stopped going there after it started getting crowded. The glitterati discovered it, and everybody started going, and of course, Brahms got out. But he loved it there, and it's a sunny and lyrical jewel that he completed, according to the autograph, in 1879, bit by bit. It is a perfectly finished piece of music. It just simply cannot be done any better than this. It was intended, of course, for Joachim, of course. It's the perfect Joachim sonata. It's long lyrical lines. It doesn't have any overt exhibitionism in it. It requires an artist to play well, and so on. It's the sort of stuff he would always play beautifully. So he sent a copy to Clara Schumann, and she said back, she said, "You can imagine my delight when, after the first delicate and charming movement in the second movement, I found once again in the third my adored melody with the enchanting quaver notation." Quavers are eighth notes, okay? That's what they are. What she's referring to is what we call the Rain Song, the Regenlied, which Brahms had written, Opus 59. It's one of his loveliest art songs.
Kindheit träumte, wenn das Nass im Sande schäumte.
That figure. Bam, ba, bam, bam, bi, last movement. Yam, da, da, ya, dee, da, dam, da, da. That's what you hear at the opening of the last movement. And it turns out to be based on that melody, with the piano going da 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 dee 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 dee. But you know something? It's not just the last movement. He mines it for other materials, including the main melody of the first movement. When the violin comes in at the opening of the first movement, guess what? It goes yam da da. But it's different. It goes yam da da ya da da dee. I'm singing too low. I'm sorry. Yam dee dee dam dam da dee da. But that dotted rhythm, yam da da, which he then uses for the second theme of the first movement, where it goes yam ta da da. Just moves the dot over. Yam da ya da. Yan-da-da, ya-da-da-dum-da-da. It's all the way through. In other words, perfectly constructed music. Perfectly constructed. Now, the first movement has to be among this man's finest constructions. It has to be. And that's saying a lot, isn't it? It's a very taut sonata form, classical sonata form, exposition, development, and recapitulation. But he has all of the themes you usually have. You have a primary theme, which gives way to a transitional theme, which gives way to a secondary theme in the new key, and a closing theme, stop, and then you go on to the development. All of this is part of sonata form. He manages to cover a lot of that up. It's beautifully done. They're all still there. It's all still there. But the thing flows along just like this beautiful vine growing out of its seed. So you don't really notice the sectional quality that sonata form has. That sort of dramatic thing. You just don't notice it. Which means that if I give this movement to a less experienced student and say, here's your assignment for 2 weeks, I want a full analysis of the form, the kid's probably going to come back weeping. Or I'm going to get something that's the raving of a lunatic. He said, I couldn't figure this out, so here's what I'm thinking. I said, what? And so on. But in fact, though, once you begin understanding how Brahms is building it isn't that hard to put together. Time for your theory lesson. Here we go. Now, the first movement works like this. Like all expositions of sonata forms, it begins with, hey, guess what? A primary theme. Now, in this piece, what he does is when he repeats the primary theme, he starts repeating it, yum, dee, dee, ya, da, 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 that. He turns that into a transition that starts taking us into the secondary theme. So I'm using a symbol you probably haven't seen before, PT, which means primary theme turned transitional. Okay, that's what PT means, primary transitional. That leads us directly into the secondary theme, which is in the new key. Ya dum da 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 dee da dum dee dee ya. That leads into the first actual transition. Ya dum dee dee ya dum dee dee. Dotted rhythms again, and that takes us to the first closing theme, 1K, first closing theme. Yum dee da dum dee da dum, and then the second closing theme. Ya da dee da da dee ya da dee da da dum, like that. Now, one of the reasons for doing it this way is that when you write the recapitulation, that's the third part of the sonata form, the recap, if you remember your elementary school class, if you ever took it, the recap is sort of the expo again, but without the modulation. It stays in the same key. Now, that makes that sound very easy, but in fact, it's where you find the cleverest writing, because you've got to mask the fact you haven't modulated. It's got to sound fresh anyway. Here's how Brahms does it. It's simple, gorgeous, perfect. Starts out exactly as you'd expect. This is the recap. But then, ha 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 ha, he doesn't do that primary transition. He doesn't need it. He's not going to change key. So he goes directly to the secondary theme. Ya dum dee dee da da dee dum dee dee in the home key. And then the rest, pretty much according to Hoyle, just kind of goes burbling right along. How simple. Because the exposition is so masterfully written, he doesn't have to do anything fancy for his recap. So that's the recapitulation. Of course, it goes over there. And in between those two, we have the middle section, which is called, of course, the development, right? The development. This development is organically unified almost down to the cellular level, and it's made up almost entirely of the primary theme. Yum, ba bum, that part of it, or ya da 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 dee da 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 da. It's made up out of all of that, what he can mine out of that, over and over and over. At one moment, he starts bringing in ya da dee da da dum dee da dee dee da da, that. And then there's a little retransition. That's the moment where we know we're coming back to the recap. Okay, it's like that last straightaway, right? And of course, almost all sonata form movements end with a coda. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. But the fascinating thing is all those different sections, all that P and PT and S and T and 1K and 2K and blah, 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 all of that is spun out of a few simple ideas. He grew a great beanstalk out of one little tiny bean. Seriously cool. The performance is gorgeous. Second phrase, primary D. Then, but it begins moving forward now. Do you know that we've modulated to a new key? You really can't tell, can you? It's so beautifully done. But we're in D major now. And here we go. Based on the same idea. Da 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 ya da da da. And then ba be bum ba ba. Dee da da da. Dee da. Da, da, da. Then scales. Sounds like it's going to repeat, but it's the development. Here we go. A flat major, a long way away from home. Everybody's copying everybody else. dee-dum, ba-dee, dee-dum, ba-dee, dee-dum. But now hints come. More hints. Now, it's going to be so seamless, you're not going to be aware you're in the recap until after it's happened. There it is. Right to the secondary theme. Time almost seems to stop. It's like a reminiscence. For the performance in particular, believe me, I played that enough times to know what can happen to it, and so on. It's astounding that anything that beautifully made could be that effortless sounding. You do not need to know one thing about how deeply constructed it is just to enjoy that beautiful flow, like clear water of melody that it is. That's great craft, you know. It doesn't call attention to itself. That's what great craft is. So let's take our break. I would like you back at 11:08 and 13 and a half seconds, and we will get going again. All right. 10 years between second and third symphonies, well worth it, I think. Well worth it. It's not that he wasn't doing anything. He just had said what he wanted to say with the symphonies 1 and 2, and so he waited until he had another message. And the symphony number 3 is one of his most enigmatic. It's one of his most beautiful. It's of the 4, I think it gets played the least, I would say, but still extraordinary. I'm dipping back into that Rattle set, the Simon Rattle Berlin Philharmonic set for this. Now, the 3rd symphony is a study in ambiguity. It's a study in contrast and the eventual resolution of all of that ambiguity. The very opening of the symphony kind of throws down the gauntlet, because it says at the very beginning, are we in F major or are we in F minor? I refuse to commit. You will have to decide, Bubala, where we are. In that very opening, you could say either one from listening. F major, F minor, F major, F minor. This could be either. Probably F major. Yeah. He seems to kind of making up his mind F major there towards the end. Of course, he immediately moves away from it, but, you know, so on. And there's an incredible spot, that main theme, yadi, yamba-da-di, yum-bum-ba. We don't hear it again. And until the very end of the development, and that middle section, and he states it in what has to be one of the most ambiguous things ever. It's like, where are we? What are we? What time is this? What is happening here in this? It's just, it's like everything sort of stops. And we're going, what? Happening. This is the retransition. And major, minor. And once again, we don't totally know. Major seems to be winning out. But, you know, it could be sort of a Pyrrhic victory. We don't really know. You know, we just don't know. Now, this incredible symphony, with all of its glory, doesn't actually have a fast inner movement. Most symphonies do. You know, they got a scherzo movement, a fast movement in there. This one doesn't. What it has for second and third place is a real slow movement and then a kind of slow movement. All right, and so that's what it is. And the third movement, the kind of slow movement, it depends on who's conducting, okay? If it's Eschenbach, it's a real slow movement. If it's Monteux, it's a kind of slow movement. It's like one of his piano intermezzis. That is it's very simple ternary form, 3-part form, A, B, A. That simple variation and so on. But within that, again, this is one of those movements that the mastery is such that you almost can't believe it's so well made. One little hint I'll give you about it. Listen very carefully for his use of the clarinet, which comes by in the third part. It is absolutely ravishing. And also, one of the reasons I chose this particular performance, I need to look up the name here, is the new horn player in the Berlin Philharmonic who was new to the orchestra when this was made. Beyond belief in terms of good horn playing. It really is. So this incredibly wonderful movement, ABA form, just incredible. Incredible. Cello. And the violins take it. Beautiful theme. Then the winds come back. Section. Not as clearly thematic, more like treading water. Back to the winds. Strings. How beautifully he balances winds to strings. Get a load of this horn playing. Here it comes. Oboe. clarinet until now. Here it comes. Violins come in. Whole orchestra. Strings and winds. I'm a connoisseur of orchestras. It doesn't get any better than that. That's as good as orchestra playing as you will ever hear. That horn player, the clarinetist, that oboist, oh my God. And perfectly balanced between that. He was a great orchestrator by this point. He had become a great one. No bling, no fancy, no nothing, right? But only a great orchestrator would have held the clarinet out that long and then bring it in for that one special moment. That's the writing of a master artist, to do that. All right. Wow. We're going to finish with a fun movement, okay? Something that's rather virtuosic and fun and flamboyant, and Brahms at his Brahmsiest best. His second piano trio, he wrote 3 trios for 2 strings and piano, for violin, cello, and piano. There's also a trio for horn, violin, and piano. Well, that's a honey. And there's a trio, a very late trio for clarinet, cello, and piano, which we will do next week, a movement of. This one is one of my absolute favorites. I've played this a lot. I have very fond memories once of a concert with the late Larry Granger, who was a member of the San Francisco Symphony, and Stacey Phelps Wenzel, and we played that. It was one of those evenings where everything just went. You know, they sometimes happen. I mean, Larry talked about it for years. He said, remember that? I said, yeah. It was like perfect. Yeah, I know. You know, it's like, wow. You know, we just hit the groove. You know, just, oh. And what it would be great was with this piece, because this has got to be one of the great, great all-time piano trios. Now, 1883, and for his third movement, he writes a full Beethovenian scherzo. This is the scherzo. Now, a scherzo replaces the old minuet movement of the symphony that Mozart and Haydn had. The scherzo is basically a minuet supercharged and gone psychopathic. Right? So, instead of being it is sort of a dainty dance movement, it is now a hell for leather sort of thing. For Beethoven, of course, that made perfect sense, right? He wasn't about to write minuets at a certain point in his life. And Brahms continued the Beethoven tradition in writing scherzi in his large chamber works. But he writes them, of course, they're Brahms scherzos. They are not Beethoven scherzos. And by the way, I should mention that the plural of scherzo can be either scherzi or scherzos. It's in the process of becoming an English word. It's sort of like concertos. It's pretty much the norm now instead of concerti. Scherzo is pretty much the same way. It's becoming an ordinary English word that takes an English plural instead. So I love watching that happen with words, you know? So like that. Now, just to talk to you a tiny bit about the scherzo, is that one of the big differences with Brahms versus Beethoven is that the middle section, that is the second scherzo of the form, in Brahms is almost always very lyrical. Beethoven tends to write 2 scherzos back to back and make them both scherzo-ish. But Brahms tends to go lyrical with his. That's a very different. Now, let me tell you how these things work, just in case you need a little background. Minuets, scherzos, all of them, there are what are called compound forms. That is, there are one complete form added to another complete form. That's the compound, like that. And then you play the first complete form, you play the second complete form, and at the end of the second complete form, the composer writes the words da capo, from the beginning, from the head. So you go back and play number one all over again. So it becomes dance one, dance two, dance one, da capo. That's the way almost all of them are written. Beethoven started challenging that because I think he felt that it was crimping his style. So what he started doing was, instead of going da capo, he started writing the thing out. So you got dance one, dance two, dance three. And dance three was like dance one, but rewritten. Like in the Fifth Symphony, for example, he does that. And when he gets to dance three becomes the segue into the last movement. You know, it's completely rewritten like that. Brahms started doing that. You don't find a lot of da capos in Brahms. What you find are fully written out pieces. And that's what this one does. That's what this does. Now, there are a lot of repeats in the internal forms, the three scherzos one after another, and they all have a lot of internal repeats. So you wind up, basically, what you wind up with is a 12-part form. That is scherzo number one, part one, repeated. Part two and three, repeated. So therefore, there are 4 parts to each scherzo, 12 altogether. Alrighty? It's not difficult. It's just kind of the way they work. Obviously, this could turn into sort of like a piecemeal jigsaw puzzle kind of form. This is Brahms. Ain't going to happen. This particular movement is fast. It's like almost almost a nightmare scenario in some ways, except it's very broad. And then the middle section, which is just ravishing. This performance, the Florestan Trio, it's a English group, combines absolute precision. It's like, I don't think these string players could play out of tune to save their lives, with passion and beauty. The two don't often go together, but this group does it. Okay? So, paintings by Albert Bierstadt. I don't know why this piece just makes me think of those American landscapes or his fathers accompany the performance, and I'm going to put on labels that show you where we are. Alrighty, in the thing, but that's all I'm going to do. So, but just listen to this playing again. In terms of actual just performing, oh wow. Here we go. Middle scherzo. normally written as a da capo, but it's fully written out. Here we go. Some movement, huh? A great performance. By the way, the whole trio, what happens immediately after that is it launches into a last movement that has that same sense of unease. Ya bum bi ya dum bum bi ya da, and then erupts into heroics. Da yan dun dee da dum bum ba. Great stuff. Great stuff. So there we are with this part of it. Now here's what's happening next week. We reach the 1890s essentially. I'm going to talk about the Fourth Symphony a little bit at that time. And we'll be taking a certain sort of regretful, nostalgic tone next week as the years ran out and his late period, which was a beautiful Beethovenian late period, except rather more approachable, I think, than that. As he lived through, all of his friends died one by one. He was alone. His music took on this very golden, beautiful aura to it. Late Brahms, there's really nothing like it. There's a lot of it. And that's where we will dwell next week. All right, have a wonderful week, folks, and thank you. Thank you. Thank you.